Hello, my name is Daniel, and I want to welcome you to this edition of Ethical Considerations for Responsible Space Commercialization. I hope you enjoy this presentation and it inspires you to further investigate the supreme high ground, outer space. Now, with no further ado, let's jump right into it with both feet and get started. During this edition, we'll dive into the issues within the current space regulatory framework, focusing on cultivating resources, new liabilities, and problems with the current language and enforcement. From there, we'll discuss the effects of space debris and its implications on the congested, contested, and competitive environments. We'll also discuss some of the risks that is involved within space debris. Finally, we'll wrap up this session with discussing the health factors with which can present themselves during prolonged space exposure, specifically what you can expect as a result of isolation and from radiation. Commercial expansion into cislunar has defined the last several years as part of the next industrial revolution. The explosion of commercial space capabilities has even started conversations surrounding the possibility of colonizing space. These advancements, while providing both economic and military advantages, do not exempt the application from ethical considerations for their execution. As the space industry experiences significant changes due to technological progress, the current regulatory framework, primarily based on the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 and other related agreements, faces challenges with adaptation. The issue of the space debris poses a significant challenge for space governance, especially as activities in LEO increases and practices such as anti-satellite testing continue. The growing number of satellites and debris fragments orbiting Earth is leading to a more crowded and complex space environment. And lastly, exploration beyond Earth's atmosphere poses distinct challenges to human health, necessitating comprehensive evaluation of the long-term effects of the space environment. This involves addressing not only the physical risks associated with radiation exposure and microgravity, but also the psychological impacts of isolation and restricted resources, all of which influence both mental and physical well-being. The first consideration, which will drive and in some cases resolve others, is refining substandard or developing new industry regulations. The cornerstone of space regulations is currently the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which focuses on keeping space free from militarization efforts and delineating it as a peaceful domain to serve the benefit of all humankind. To the benefit of humanity, however, the technological advancements within the space industry have dramatically changed the scope of space activities and capabilities since the Cold War. These advancements have created modern day challenges and constraints which will require serious consideration to address regulatory gaps and ensure the responsible and ethical exploration of space. The first challenge is the competition and mining for interplanetary resources. As both states and private organizations focus on lunar and asteroid mining, a range of complex legal questions emerge. As countries including the United States, Russia, and China announce intentions for ongoing lunar bases, discussions regarding fair access to and oversight of these resources are becoming increasingly relevant. The expansion of civilian spaceflight introduces new considerations regarding the liability too. Private companies are now transporting civilians beyond Earth's atmosphere, creating questions about responsibility should there be potential accidents or damage. Civilians are not astronauts and therefore will not be covered underneath the 1972 Liability Convention. The OST is established before significant growth in the commercial space industry and has not even been amended to reflect the change of Russia from the USSR to the Russian Federation after its collapse. As space traffic increases, so too does the risk of potential collisions. Current regulatory frameworks for safety and traffic management in outer space are inadequate and do not provide comprehensive guidelines. Additionally, ambiguous terms like national activities and non-governmental entities create loopholes that let private companies avoid regulation while allowing states to flexibly interpret these categories, which further obscure treaty enforcement. Among the five principal law treaties, only the Liability Convention and the Registration Convention establish frameworks for enforcement, and even these are somewhat limited in scope. Additionally, organizations face constraints regarding enforcement authority, as their reliance on diplomatic consensus can impede timely action, potentially allowing private entities to avoid accountability for their violation of international law. One of the clearest and most troubling shortcomings of current space governance involves space debris and anti-satellite testing. The proliferation of low Earth orbit promotes the irresponsibility of polluting the space environments with debris and space junk. At the present, there is no binding international legal framework for regulating debris, and existing guidelines are based on voluntary compliance only. So what does it mean to be congested? As of July of 2025, there is approximately 48,400 satellites which have been launched into orbit. Of those, 18,500 objects are considered debris larger than 4 inches, according to the United States Space Force. However, there are roughly 1.1 million debris fragments between 0.04 and 3.9 inches. Over the coming decade, tens of thousands more satellites are expected to be deployed by companies, all aiming to establish mega constellations. Additionally, China also has strategies to develop mega constellations consisting of at least 13,000 additional satellites. These increasing satellite launches exacerbate risks associated with the presence of the Comprehensive International Space Traffic Management and Collision Avoidance. This issue compounds the ongoing challenges presented by the rapid growth of the space debris, and there is broad consensus among stakeholders that this approach is unsustainable over the long term. For the contested environments, the US, China, Russia, and other nations have acknowledged or acted in ways in which they have contributed to space being regarded as a warfighting domain. Simultaneously, numerous of unresolved challenges persist regarding the use of space for military operations, and the rules of engagement in space environment are non-existent. For instance, there is no international consensus on permissible proximity between satellites, nor are there established guidelines for the responsible deployment of dual-use technologies. The use of satellite arms, for instance, which may serve both benign repair functions and potentially hostile purposes against adversary satellites, highlights the importance of determining appropriate context, timing, and locations for their employment to prevent misinterpretations. In competition, spacefaring nations and private entities are actively competing for access to orbital space, which is limited in both low Earth orbit and geosynchronous. The proper functionality of satellites and other orbit objects depends on their positioning within these orbits, as well as access to specific regions of the radio frequency spectrum that are critical for satellite communications. As the number of participants in space exploration increases, this competition is expected to intensify, potentially resulting in disputes over the control and use of scarce resources. Collisions between space debris pose a significant risk to potential satellites and spacecraft, potentially leading to the cascade effect known as the Kessler syndrome. This syndrome occurs when collisions between debris generates even more debris, similar to the compounding interest in a financial market, only it's bad, as it potentially is making certain orbits unusable. Additionally, the increasing number of debris poses a greater risk to future space missions, including and specifically to manned missions. The greater the congestion within LEO, the more difficult it will become to find a trajectory to launch into a higher orbit or conduct interplanetary travel. Understanding the effects of spaceflight on humans is essential as space travelers move from the tourism in low Earth orbit to, to a deep space destination on or around the moon or eventually to Mars. Understanding the differences and effects with which the space environment has on humans during temporary space travel versus long-term duration space flights is key to determining the ethical implications for consideration when subjecting civilians to the dangerous and potential deadly environment. The effects of isolation include the feeling of boredom and loneliness which can occur, with the potential for such experiences to increase during extended deep space missions where communication with mission control and family becomes less frequent. Other possible effects include stress and anxiety, fatigue, sleep difficulties related to reduced natural light and disrupted sleep cycles, irritability, mood fluctuations, sensitivity, and emotional distress. Microgravity represents a primary environmental stressor that distinguishes the space stations from terrestrial environments, fundamentally influencing the physical, chemical, and biological processes typically governed by the gravity on Earth. An individual's circadian rhythm may be disturbed also, which could result in sleep loss, degrading in performance, loss of concentration and memory, impaired alertness, as well as depression and anxiety. Research indicates that disturbance of the circadian rhythms can lead to neurobiological dysfunction. Beyond low Earth orbit, individuals may be exposed to increased level of space radiation, which is associated with the potential risks such as radiation sickness, cancer, central nervous system effects, and degenerative diseases. Researches on various doses of intensities of radiation indicates the exposure to galactic cosmic rays and solar particle events is linked to higher likelihood of cancer and degenerative diseases. The medical risks related to cardiovascular complications from exposure to charged particles irradiation may be greater than previously recognized. Ionizing radiation has long been associated with damage to heart and blood vessels, and an elevated risk of cardiovascular disease such as ischemic heart disease and stroke has been observed in subjects decades after exposure. Additionally, radiation exposure can impede neurogenesis, which is the process by which new cells are generated within the brain. Also, within the central nervous system, such effects may contribute to cognitive impairment, which deficits in memory function. In some cases, it can lead to various forms of cancers, including skin, brain, breast, ovarian, leukemia, and lung cancers. To wrap up, the current framework for space governance poses considerable challenges and risks to the future of space operations and private sector investments. Specifically, competition and mining for interplanetary resources, the growth of civilian spaceflight, and the sufficiency of present regulations for safety and traffic management in outer space are key considerations. The increasing number of LEO and commercial satellite launches has resulted in a significant accumulation of orbital debris, which endangers activities in active spacecraft and the overall sustainability of space activities. Furthermore, extended exposure to the space environment presents substantial challenges to both the psychological and physical health of individuals participating in space exploration. Factors such as isolation, microgravity, social confinement, disruptions to the circadian rhythms, and radiation exposure introduce considerable risks to mental well-being and psychological stability. Effectively addressing these concerns is essential for the progression of space tourism and for ensuring the safety and welfare of all space travelers. So, my friends, this concludes this session of ethical considerations for the responsible space commercialization. Until we meet again, continue exploring.